welcome back to What She Said. I'm your host, Lucy Lugraft. I'm a journalist, blogger, and you're listening to Series 4, episode Using Patreon for Your Business. If you want to skip this intro and jump straight into the chat, head to about 1 minute, one time. If not, let me tell you about Aja. She is a badass in sustainable fashion world, and I'm very lucky to call her a friend. A stylist and writer, she champions intersectionality within the green movement and educates her audience on all manner of things, from greenwashing to climate change, and she calls out bullshit wherever she's. We chatted about Patreon, where Aja creates a whole heap of valuable content. She actually makes the majority of her income through Patreon. It's really interesting. She has one of the best Patreons around, so I knew I wanted to get her to the good, the bad, and the downright. Okay, so before we jump in, it's time to share my review, which is from Rabia, aka She Flourished. She says, this podcast is brilliant. Lucy not only brings on engaging guests, but also solo episodes that are incredibly insightful. For all this blogging and living life online, this is the one. Expert. Okay, that's enough for me. Enjoy.
My name is Aja Barber. I am a stylist and consultant and writer. Sometimes people try and say activist, but I'm like, please don't do that, because everybody expects activists to be perfect in their opinion and have an opinion on everything, where I am the type of person where I want to stay in my lane. So my work focuses clearly on fashion, but I talk about feminism and race and ethical fashion and sustainability and how we go forward as better humans, keeping all of these things in mind, because as you and I both know, the fashion industry has done a real trash job of like talking about all of this stuff for so long. And, you know, I also talk about white supremacy because it is actually linked to all of these issues, whether we're talking about colonization, fat phobia, patriarchy. It's all white supremacy at the end of the day.
Yep.
And so, you know, in the work of Kimberly Crenshaw focuses on intersections, and all of these things are intersections. Wealth equality, who can afford to have, who can't, that sort of thing. So if we really focus on a few of the big things, I think we can tackle some of the little ones. And so my work sort of brings everything into the fold. And I also help people get dressed. I style clients, and I help them to pick out clothing that they're going to love for a lifetime. We do not do anything from high street. I point my clients in the direction of independent designers, Etsy sellers, and we also buy some secondhand stuff. I've taught a few people how to use like eBay very effectively and the various secondhand sites. So that's what I do.
In a nutshell.
Yeah.
And I think your work is particularly interesting, and one of the things that I wanted to talk about today was how you make a bulk of your income through Patreon. And I am one of your patrons, and know firsthand of the value that you offer there, and really it's almost like a magazine.
That's a nice compliment. Thank you so much. Because I do work really hard at it. I think people see you on Instagram, and that's just a portion of what you do.
And I think one of the ways that you differ for me, and I don't support a huge amount of Patreons, and I only really discovered it through Kate O'Sullivan last year, is that it just reminds me very much of some of the fashion sites and beauty blogs that I used to follow, which were about breaking news and kind of really current affairs commentary and a lot of opinion, as well as some of the like more, I don't want to say lighthearted, as if that's
I have jokes, and I do keep it kind of lighthearted because I always have like, you know, gossip bits and things that I sort of file as petty. But at the end of the day, one of the things that my Patreon subscribers get is they get a really untainted opinion. There's no advertisement. So basically, if I think a brand is being, can I swear here?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
If I think a brand is being shitty, I'm going to say it. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to lighthearted, dress it up, that sort of thing. No. If a brand is doing something that's super shitty, then I'm going to say it. And that's why people, I think, are really attracted to the work that I do on Patreon, because that's actually a real rarity in the fashion and beauty industry, whether it's on Instagram, whether it's in magazines, whether it's on blogs. Once you get sponsorship in there, the opinions become quite I don't know, I want to say a little tainted.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
not as honest as people think. And I've read a lot of, I love reading biographies of old fashioned editors and people that have retired. And they'll tell you, yeah, the reason we did this cover with this actress and that t-shirt by that designer is because that designer, was one of our biggest advertisers that year. And
Yeah.
it's like, okay. So once you sort of know that information about the fashion industry and you realize that a lot of the information that you're being fed is being fed through a filter of who has money and who doesn't and who's paying this amount and who's not, then you realize that a lot of what you're actually reading is it's what's the word I'm looking for?
It's n
Influenced by
Yeah, it's
outside
biased, isn't
factors.
it? Yeah.
Yes.
Which is why I think it's so, so funny that so much of traditional media is constantly calling out influence like modern day media for their authenticity, because I'm like, pot calling the kettle black?
Yeah. Yeah,
Like, are you
exactly.
joking? Can you really say that when Condé Nast is practically sponsored by, one designer or one fashion house? Or, do you know what I mean? LVMH will
Yes.
probably take up their half of their fashion pages.
Oh goodness, yeah, no, totally. And so yeah, it's funny. And they only do that because they are threatened by influencers and the power that influencers hold. And I am not beholden to any magazine, honestly. I'm glad that they're threatened. I think that they haven't been doing right by people for a very long amount of time. And so, and the thing with the magazine industry is that there's still so many firsts. It's like, oh, Beyonce put pressure on Vogue to actually use a black photographer last year for her beautiful cover where she's wearing that amazing floral headpiece. She actually went to Vogue and said, I'm not going to do this unless you use a black photographer. That was the first black photographer to do a cover for Vogue. And this is a magazine that's over 100 years old. So I feel like the magazine industry really hasn't done right by a lot of us. And so I'm glad they're threatened. They need to do better.
Yeah, I agree. For their own people as well. I mean, they haven't been paying freelancers fairly for a long time.
Oh, I know. It's ridiculous because there's so much money in magazines. So how is it this way? How is it this way that there's so much like um intern abuse? I think that if you have a company that is pulling in over a certain amount of money, I don't think that it should be legal for you to have unpaid internships. I don't. And whether you're paying freelancers fairly, it's all of that stuff where you're just wondering, so who's actually getting paid here? Where is this money going? Because we all know advertisers are giving you all big bucks.
That actually neatly brings us round to, well, I want to talk about why you started your Patreon initially, because actually, you often talk about the fact that no brand will ever sponsor you because you're
That's
so
true.
honest.
The only way I work with a brand is if it's a small brand that I like. I do not trade money with brands ever because no one is going to tell me what I can talk about on Instagram ever. But if it is a small brand where I like their product and they want to send me something for free and I like it, I'll wear it on the grid. Because the thing is, with this whole formula of influencer and Instagram and this and that, the smaller brands can't afford to pay people thousands of dollars to wear their clothing, which is something that the bigger brands are doing. And the bigger brands are the ones that I actually happen to take issue with because there are a lot of the ones that are tied to issues in sustainability, ethics, labor, that sort of thing. The bigger brands are the only ones that have the money for basically the sponsored posts. So I would rather actually just wear smaller brands for free, essentially, than have to sort of grapple with my own ethics and morals about working with a company that was connected to the Rana Plaza collapse a few years ago,
Yeah, yeah. However much they like to talk about their
Absolutely. Absolutely.
not naming anyone, of course, but I'm sure you can tell who we're talking about.
I mean, but it's not just that brand. I
No.
would say there are very few brands that exist on our high street where I would feel comfortable with their production line and the stuff that they're putting out there in order to make people feel comfortable about their clothing. I don't feel comfortable with any of it, to be quite honest.
Yeah, I would agree. And I've even seen for ethical kind of bloggers and stuff, and when they talk about this So there's a couple of high street stores that are considered the most ethical of the bunch, but it's very much stated as this is the best of a bad bunch. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
so
And
yeah,
here's the thing, the process of fast fashion is inherently unethical to its core. Producing things at that volume isn't good for the earth. No matter how much you PR spin it to say that you're doing better in this way, you're doing better for that way in that way. If you're producing millions of garments every day, you are a part of the problem. So the only way to me that a bigger brand can be better is if they downsize. And we all know that brands like profit margins. So that's not going to happen. They're not going to do that of their own accord. They will do that if middle class people like you and I start making those decisions to not patronize that anymore. But they're not going to just say, "Oh yeah, we're not going to take these profits anymore." We're going to, because that's not how corporations and capitalism works. But if you and I and the listener are at a certain what's the word I'm looking for? Socioeconomic status, and we have the ability to say no to these brands, then we should.
yeah. And I think it's really important. And you talk about accessibility a lot in terms of ethical fashion. Well, in terms of everything, really, because you are a true intersectional feminist. But I think it's really important to point out that actually it's people of our socioeconomic status and above that have to do more than the people who can't.
Yes.
Because otherwise it's not fair. We can't expect everybody to be doing exactly the same, because that's not how the world is.
Absolutely. See, the thing about my feminism is that I'm always constantly looking at privilege. It's not correct, it's not right by me to go and look at someone who's at a different socioeconomic line as me and go, "Oh, well, why aren't you buying more sustainable?" The single mother who has to dress her two kids should not have to carry this weight that, I, I just think if you are at a position where you can make that choice, then you should make that choice. But we have to recognize, if we want our movements to be intersectional, that not everyone can make that choice. That's just the reality of what the world is. But also, the people that fall around or below the poverty line are not the ones that have actually made these problems. you know so like, we should not task them with cleaning up something that has been made by like the upper middle class. That's just it
Absolutely.
doesn't work.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm pretty sure the middle classes patronize ASOS more than anyone else.
Absolutely.
That's a really good point. So yeah, is that where did tell me where Patreon started for you? Why did you come up with the idea? What was the initial plan for it?
For me, everyone kept telling me, you need to monetize your grid, you need to monetize your grid. And I was just thinking, I don't want to. I'm looking at all the brands that are offering sponsorship. And first and foremost, like, brands do not like the word white supremacy. Brands do not like the phrase colonization. Sorry, the phrase white supremacy, the word colonization. All of these words that I regularly use on my grid are not brand friendly, because brands continue to sort of, I don't know, profit from a lot of these things. And so they're not very keen on giving money to someone who's pointing it out very loudly. And then on top of that, when we look at who's actually getting the sponsors, it's not Black women. It's upper middle class white ladies. So I kept hearing people tell me that I should really think about getting some sponsors, but I was thinking, who am I going to work with? Like, I know these small brands, and I love a lot of small brands and talk about the small brands that I love, but like, they're not going to be able to support me. And then I thought about how people are just always asking me for information. And I was thinking, yeah, I'm happy to give out this information, but I think that people should actually consider their source and paying people for, good information. I don't think any information is free. And that's one of the things that I constantly tell my audience, is that if someone on Instagram is telling you about this free, great product that they love and they think that you're going to love it too, that product is not being sold to you for free. Like nothing is sold to you for free. When you click that link to swipe up to buy that product, a brand is getting your information. They're figuring out where you came from. They're looking at what age group you sort of fall in because you kind of came in on a wave. So like, let's look at where this came from. Let's look at who's told you this information. They're getting a lot of information from that one swipe up, and that information is worth millions of dollars. It really is. And so I just thought, what if I could sort of sideswipe all of that, get away from that, and just tell people if you want pure, untainted information from me about what I like, what I think is good, and you want opinions about where to shop, and you know that like my opinion is not weighted on getting a check for a couple $1,000s from this fast fashion brand that's trying to do better, then maybe you should get in the idea of paying for that information. Because here's the thing, even though I'm on Patreon, I actually support like 12 Patreons at the minute. And I was supporting people on Patreon before I had my own Patreon because I see that there's value there and supporting the work that people do. And so much of what I've learned and what I use in my work comes from the women and non-binary people that I support on Patreon. So if I'm taking information from a source, I need to be paying to support that source because I am profiting in a way, whether it's in my space or in another space. I mean, people tell me all the time, yeah, I used your Instagram post in a presentation that I did at my work. So that's people that are working at probably multinational companies that are taking what I'm putting out there for free and using it in a corporation. And I do kind of not really like that, but I sort of point out to people that that's a various way that people are using what I'm teaching, what they're learning from me, in a way where I'm not getting paid. And so I do have people sort of on the honor system where if you know that you really, really are absorbing what I'm saying, enjoying what I'm saying, really liking my recommendations, then maybe think about paying for those sort of resources. And when you pay for it, you obviously get so much more,
Yeah. And I think it's such a clever system that you have in particular because whatever tier that you're at, you get a heap of value. But then the higher up the tiers you go, it becomes kind of exponential. That you can have personal styling at your top tier.
Yeah. Yeah. So my personal styling is my top tier. And I'll explain how that works. Basically, every personal style client that I have has an hour with me per month where we really work on shaping your wardrobe. And I work with everybody. So basically, there's a lot of women who have come to me that have basically felt completely forgotten about by the fashion industry. I've had clients where they've said, this is the first time that I've gone to work and someone has complimented my clothing. I can't imagine feeling like that because I'm not quote unquote standard size. Like I've grown up loving clothes and really cherishing them and feeling, like a good outfit can really change your outlook and can really sort of like change your life in a way. And so to have that taken from you because the industry doesn't think that you're important enough to dress, it really bothers me. Really, really gets on my tits. So I work with a lot of clients. People say I'm a size, 3X. Do you think you can help me? And I can because I know designers, I know style, I know Etsy, I know eBay, and I know a lot of really great plus size companies that are popping up every day. And so I work with people to get them to a point where they really enjoy clothing. And we don't buy anything from the high street. We work with all independent designers. I've taught quite a few people how to shop eBay. I've taught people how to shop The Real Real, which doesn't have a very good plus size section, but I'm hoping they'll expand on that in the future. And it's just been so much fun. And it's been so incredibly rewarding.
Yeah, I can imagine because you're kind of hitting two massive values there of supporting small brands and getting their name out to people who maybe wouldn't have had the confidence to go out and find them, and then also helping people who, like you say, have been forgotten about by the fashion industry, which is actually a huge chunk of society.
Yeah, and it pulls other parts of my work in too, because, there might be an Etsy brand that says, I make clothing up to a 6X, and I'm like, that's great. But I've actually reached out to certain brands and said, listen, if you are going to advertise that you're going to make all these sizes, that's great, but I want some visibility on your page. Can you, if you can make any size, I'm going to send you a boatload of clients. However, I want to see more diversity, and I want to see my clients reflected. And if a brand writes back positively, that's cool. I send them those clients. If they ignore me or write back defensively, you get nothing from me.
And that's the power, isn't it? It's about the buying power and flexing it if you can.
It really is. And I think that a lot of companies still don't quite get that we are going to be more vocal. We are standing up for each other more. And basically, if you don't make plus size people a part of your business and you are making a lot of money, then I'm going to stop supporting you. And I had this conversation with someone who does run an ethical clothing company. And I do think that a few ethical clothing companies are really failing on that. They don't understand, first of all, that fat phobia is an oppression. They compare it to all sorts of other things like being petite, which is something I talk about. It is not the same thing. It is quite a different thing to walk into a store and have a sales associate tell you in very rude ways, I'm sorry, we don't have anything for you. That you're a petite person, Lucy. Has that ever happened to you?
No, never.
Exactly. But for some reason, there are some people that want their personal things to be an oppression. It's just not true. My husband's petite. It's not true. He's not discriminated against. Fat people are discriminated against.
And it goes beyond fashion, doesn't it? Because if I go to the doctor and say my shoulder hurts, no one is ever going to attribute that to weight gain or maybe you should go on a diet or even maybe you should do exercise. They're just going to presume, well, you're petite, so you're fine.
Yeah, totally. And not only that, but plus size people are like more likely to be portrayed as lazy and stupid on television shows. Like that's a really common trope. And so there's some real like oppression there in our society. And I really don't like when people try and mix it in with other things. Like someone will say, oh, well, I'm tall. It's not an oppression. My dad is 6'4", and like, yes, he has a hard time sometimes finding clothing, but people are not actively disrespectful towards him for being tall. If anything, being tall like gains him certain privileges because everyone thinks that he's like a famous basketball player. It's true. I mean, my dad actually did play basketball, but he never played professionally in the US. So like he's not famous by any stretch of the imagination. But people just assume that he's an athlete and they're like, oh, cool, people are really nice to him. That's not the experience that plus size people have in our world ever. So I really don't like when people are like, well, we don't make clothing for tall people or petite people either. I'm like, it's not the same thing. It really isn't. So I have had a couple of brands that have really failed in these conversations with me. And once that happens, I stop featuring your product on my grid. I might wear it because it would be wasteful to just be like, I'm not going to wear this anymore. That's not how we do it. Even with fast fashion, if you have your fast fashion, you should still wear it. You should just, taper down the buying of it. But when it comes to brands that don't do right by my audience in these conversations, I'm not going to present that on my grid anymore. You're not going to get free advertisement from me.
Yeah, that's the line that I've drawn for myself, that I still have fast fashion pieces in my wardrobe, and I also buy fast fashion on eBay. Like I'll buy secondhand stuff, or I do a lot of charity shop shopping. So the majority of charity shop finds are fast fashion because they are, just by very nature of it. So, but then I won't ever say, I'll only share the brand, I'll only tag a brand if they're ethical. I
Me
won't.
too. That's me.
Yeah, it's a small line but it's an important one for
No,
me.
and I actually think it's really great to shop secondhand, even if it's fast fashion. I do as well, because when you shop secondhand, you aren't actually like driving the economy of fast fashion because a brand can only profit once. So if you're going to buy a fast fashion top in Zara, for instance, they're going to take note of that number. How long has it sat on the shelf for? Okay, so there's a demand for it. We have to make more. But when you buy it secondhand from a charity shop, there's no profit margin there for the brand. There's no drive for it, and you're saving something from either a landfill or being dumped on a developing country who doesn't want our fast fashion cast-offs. So it's actually a real win to shop secondhand. I always tell people that.
And I think it plays into kind of trying to push for more of a circular economy, that buying secondhand is one of the best ways you can close that loop.
Yes. I'm actually doing a panel about that at the end of
Ooh.
this week. So yeah, no, it really is. And so that's what I definitely push for my audience. And that's something that I share a lot on Patreon. If I find something really cool on eBay, I will share it and be like, someone please buy this. Like it's a really good price. This is how much this brand costs full price. This is, what you'll pay for this, but this is just a really beautiful garment and it will make you happy and blah blah blah. That's how you can style it. So yeah, I love when people shop secondhand.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about some of the ups and downs of Patreon, because we were sort of talking offline before we started recording, and both of us, well, I think we're both having different issues, but yeah, things that probably pertain to quite a lot of people's problems when they start a Patreon. So it'd be great to chat about them. And one is when when you lose a lot of patrons, because sometimes that just happens.
Yeah, that actually happened with me this month, and I think some people, I think there were some credit cards that didn't go through because someone else actually posted, someone that I support on Patreon said, "Hey, I think a bunch of your credit cards didn't go through, so please update your card or whatever." But so maybe it's just a thing, but I also think people see that my platform is growing and they equate that with me having money. And it's just not, the bulk of my income still comes from my Patreon, and it will. I'm not trying to do sponsorships with brands in any way. And so when people just see that my numbers have grown or that I'm getting speaking engagements, they just assume that like, oh, well, she's doing fine now. And it's like, no, but I still am not taking money from brands. I'm still not monetizing this grid. And so, yes, I do still live off of the support that I get through Patreon. And so I think I'll have to sort of do a little post or live about that because I think people equate speaking engagements to like big bucks, but I have to remind people I'm not Tony Robbins. A lot of speaking engagements that I do for free, so it's the most I've ever gotten paid for a speaking engagement is £250, and that is that was really quite like wow, like very exciting for me because a lot of the stuff I do for free. I just did a panel at Central St. Martin's that was free. It was a great opportunity to meet some amazing people, but I did not get paid for that. So I always have to remind people just because you see that my platform's growing doesn't mean that my paycheck is growing.
Yeah, and I think it's that like idea that the more visible we are, the more money we have. And I sometimes have people, kind of friends and family, being like, "Oh my God, you're so busy at the moment." Like, I don't. Are you telling me that or asking me? And why are you assuming that? And that might be because I've just been on Instagram a bit more than normal. Which normally equates to the fact that I'm earning less money because I've got less time to work.
Yes. Yeah, Instagram takes time. So I microblog on Instagram, and people don't realize, like, I write every single morning, and that takes time. It's not like I'm just throwing something up there. Like, I do think about what I'm going to write, and, like, it's just people don't realize how much work actually goes into maintaining this platform, both Instagram and Patreon. People will say, "Oh, well, will you I do a book club, which I've actually really lagged on recently because I've been so busy. And people keep asking me if I will move book club to Patreon, but then that really limits who can join book club and who can't. And I don't think that all resources should be behind a paywall. But also, if I move everything from book club to Patreon, that's three different places that I'm having to post on really daily.
Yeah.
That's a lot of work.
Yeah. And I think the logistics of Patreon can sometimes feel very pressured because, for kind of the listener's knowledge, when a patron changes their subscription from maybe one tier to a lower tier or just leaves entirely, they're asked why, and given a few options, I think, or they can give their own kind of qualitative bit of feedback. And I had a bit of feedback that they expected that I would have engaged more. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting, because I've been a bit like, oh, I don't really know what I should be creating for my Patreon subscribers. So what I settled on, because the point of it is to fund the podcast, because I didn't want sponsors. And so I decided I would do a behind the scenes video every month, which I don't put anywhere else. What else? They get the podcast ahead of time, and then the top tier gets to kind of have an Ask Me Anything businessy sort of one-to-one. And I was like, oh, that's, yeah, like I'd love feedback on that. And it was really, really good, because one of my current patrons came back and was like, actually, a lot of Instagrammers are talking about, and I'm not talking about me and you, I'm talking about perhaps the Instagrammers who also get brand work and also fund through brand work, are talking about how, you know, their job is very hard and they create all this stuff for free and blah, 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 blah. And I think that kind of seeps into people who are consuming content feeling a bit like, oh, bloody hell, I just want to go onto one platform and consume the content without feeling guilty for it. I mean, I don't think this is actually what the patron was saying, but it made me think about the climate.
Yeah, I really want people to get out of the habit of thinking that everyone should create things for you for free, that anything that's on the internet should be available to you for free, because that's really not good. You know, we talk about like the election cycle in America and how there was Russian interference and this and that. You know, you have people like our parents' generation who used to tell us not to talk to strangers on the internet. They're now posting some of the most ridiculous, unfounded conspiracy theories from things that look like fake news sites, you know, and it's like, this is not a legit news site. You know what I mean? So I think there's this concept that anything that's given to you on the internet should be free, that you should run with it at face value. And I just think that's so not accurate. I think that you should always sort of have a discerning eye to the media you're consuming, who's profiting from you consuming that media, you know, and if you are enjoying a certain media, why aren't you paying for it?
Yeah.
You know?
I would completely agree. And I think that speaks to a level of entitlement that I certainly see in the UK, and I think it probably it's rooted in the fact that we've always had free healthcare. We've never had to think about anything from that point of view. I mean, you know, for myself,
the US, that too, but we don't have free healthcare.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, I'll let the UK off then.
No, it's just a level of entitlement in our society. I think, you know, like whenever I use, and I need to reach out to someone, whenever I like use a lot of someone's work and maybe like a presentation that I do, I'm going to make an effort to reach out to the person who wrote it and say, do you have PayPal? I would like to send you a tip because your work was used in this presentation that I did here. And, you know, I wouldn't have been able to do this presentation without your work, because it's really fascinating and interesting and that sort of thing, especially for women of color and marginalized people, because there's a lot of our society ripping off things from marginalized people, artists, women of color, and it's a really, really bad cycle that we have to get out of. And so I'm tasking myself to remember to pay it forward when someone writes a magazine article that you use to sort of do other work. And so that's something that I do personally, because I do think that you should pay people for their work, their labor, their resources, especially if you are enjoying what they do. I think it's really irresponsible to think that this sort of thing should just be available to you for free. Now, if you obviously fall around or below the poverty line, I'm not expecting you to um, be able to be in my highest tier or whatever. I'm just saying to be mindful of the fact that we consume, but we really need to be careful, especially with marginalized people, that we aren't taking their work for granted and the things that they do for granted. Because if so, then in some ways that mindless consumption is just as bad as the things that we want to fight against, which is mindless consuming of fast fashion, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's so important. And I wonder if it almost feels counterintuitive to so many people because of how how society is and how we've been brought up and all the rest of it. Um, I know for myself that, I went to a school that was free. I've always had free healthcare. If I think about the amount of
Don't get me
times,
wrong, I think free healthcare is amazing.
yeah, I agree. And I think it's really important that it's there. But because of all those things, it's very counterintuitive to then pay for things that I could ostensibly get for free. Even, there's newspapers that I pay The Guardian every year.
Mhm.
It's only a small amount. It's £25 a year.
Yeah.
But I always do it because I'm a journalist. So if I'm not paying for content, then how can I expect to be paid to create content?
Yeah. And that was on my list. So last year I couldn't work at all. My husband is English. I'm American. I moved here on a visa. We had to get the settlement visa for me to be able to work. So last year was a really, really expensive year for me where I didn't make any money. We just pretty much hemorrhaged it. And so this year, now that I'm getting back on my feet, I am definitely making an effort to pay for more subscriptions and to, really, I mean, yeah, you're right. We should. And I don't read The Guardian every day, but I think I am going to consider, maybe subscribing to them in addition to a few other subscriptions. Because you're right, these things go away if nobody
Mm.
pays for it.
I mean, you just look at The Independent.
Yeah.
That actually did close, and I think people. I mean, I know we've got the iPaper and we've got it online, but I think that was a massive shock to people because we were like, oh, well, it was a massive shock to white middle class people because we were like,
Yeah.
oh, hang on a moment, we just thought that would always be there and we'd be able to pay a small amount for it every Saturday or whatever,
Hmm.
and then it went,
Yeah.
and that's
No,
yeah.
I really think that we have to have a conversation in our society about values and what we value and whether these things are worth paying for. And I get messages every day from people that say, "Oh, your work is so valuable to me." And the thing I always want to ask next is, "Well, are you paying for it?" Because it's always the people I find that really aren't in a position that are like, as soon as I, finish this semester and I have a summer job. And I'm like, no, 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 I'm not speaking to you. Like when it comes to my audience, so I have 19,000 followers on Instagram. It's just the portion of my audience that made 60,000 US dollars per year actually paid for my work. I would be good because the thing I always remind my audience is that I am not trying to be Donald Trump. There will be no gold plated toilets in my future. I am trying to pay my basic needs. I am trying to move into a house at some point because me and my husband live in a flat and I can never host my family when they come over to visit us. And I'm trying to make sure that I can, help my parents out if they ever need that in their retirement because, we're middle class Black people, which means that we didn't come from any sort of generational wealth at all. And I think my parents have done very, very good. They've been good with money, but like retirement might be hard, especially since Trump is like chipping away at basic resources that sometimes the elderly need in retirement. So I'm not trying to make money so that I can be super duper wealthy. Like that's not even something I aspire to. I think being a billionaire is deeply unethical. But I do tell people I want my basic needs covered. And the thing is, if just the percentage of my audience that made over $60,000 a year actually just said, I'm going to support this work, I would never even have to have a conversation with my audience at all, because that would be more than enough for me personally. It would be good enough where I would feel very supported and that I can continue to write for free in whatever space I want, you know? And I do keep Instagram up because I want everyone to have access to resources. My book club on Facebook, which desperately needs updating, that's a free resource, you know, but I put work into both of these spaces. Patreon is the only one that's monetized. And so there's intersections in this conversation. I'm never looking at the student who, you know, doesn't have a ton of money and saying you should support my work. However, I do get a lot of like PhD candidates that will say, oh, I'd like to use your work in my dissertation. And to that, I do think I should be paid for that, because I feel like that work is going to exist in a usually white institution for all of time, you know? And so this is something that I'm doing that's contributing to a larger system that people can access and resource. But for other students and people that, you know, just really don't have it, I'm not looking at you saying you should support my work, but I know who should. And if all of the people that should support my work did, we'd be good. We'd be square.
That feels like a really good place to end it. I really wish that would be on a t-shirt.
It'll be a long block of text.
I might get it tattooed. Thank you so much for being a part of the podcast. Where can everybody find you online?
So I am on Instagram at Aja Barber. That's my name. And then on my Patreon, patreon.com/Aja Barber. If you want to support my work or get a little extra content, get a lot of opinions on where to shop and who's doing right and who's not doing right at all. And then if you really want to work with me as a stylist, reach out to me on Instagram or Patreon. I love new clients. I love helping people find clothing that makes them happy, because I do think, in the words of Vivienne Westwood, you live a much nicer life if you wear good clothing. I think I got that wrong.
Thank you so much for listening to the episode. I hope you enjoy it. You can get in touch with me on Twitter or Instagram. I'm at Lucy Lou Craft. I'd love you to leave a review for the show if you have time. All of the information that we chatted about in this episode is in the show notes. You can find everything at lucyloucraft.com/podcast. See you next week.